have been some pretty spectacular heists in the news recently, not least the £90 million diamond raid in Cannes this summer. But thieves don't always think quite so big, and they're certainly not always so successful.
In 2008, career criminal Craig Townend decided to steal a collection of rare and valuable stamps.
Craig Townend did a lot of research. He'd learned enough in order to pass off as somebody that certainly had a working knowledge of stamps and the trade.
Townend's target was a small stamp dealer in Devon. In the months leading up to the robbery, he made several phone calls to the shop using the cover story that he'd recently inherited some money and wanted to invest in stamps.
I'm Charles DeVille.
Oh, yes, of course.
He took on a different identity. He used the name Charles DeVille. He found out the stamps were certainly worth an awful lot of money.
Townend had a problem. It was the high summer and the area was teeming with tourists and locals, all potential witnesses. Stealing the stamps from the shop may not be the best plan.
At that time, he made a decision that if he was going to get hold of the stamps, that he'd have to trace the businessman back to his home address.
To get his hands on the collection, Townend decided that he and an accomplice would adopt another guise.
We had a report in that two males had gone to an address that they'd reported to be police officers, that they brandished handguns, and tried to give the impression to the homeowner that they were police officers carrying out a raid.
Police raid, get inside! Get inside! Give me money on it, £50,000! What are you talking about? Is anybody else in the house? It's my son.
Whilst he was being restrained, a firearm was actually discharged.
Over there.
Despite having previously visited the dealer's shop and turning up pretending to be policemen, bizarrely, it was only now that Townend and his accomplice decided to cover their faces as they made off with their collection worth £400,000.
Townend thought he'd got away with it, but he still had to sell the stamps on.
Stamps can have very high value, so they are quite an obvious target, but actually the trade is really quite a tight-knit community, so it's actually far more difficult to pass them off than you might think.
In London, 200 miles away from the scene of the crime, Townend then set about reinventing himself into yet another fictional character, this time to try to offload the stamps.
I'm from Stamps at Mayfair, just on Regent Street.
He named himself the Laird of Glencairn and had gone to some effort in order to convince people he was a high-level, legitimate businessman.
Thank you.
But Townend didn't realise how identifiable the stamps would be.
Colour, margins, postmarks, all of these things combine in an individual stamp to give it a fingerprint.
News of the theft had, by this time, spread around the relatively small world of stamp collecting. Despite that, Townend did manage to pull off a £10,000 sale to a London dealer. But the self-styled Laird of Glencairn then made his most foolish mistake yet.
What name do you want it made out to, sir?
Craig Townend.
Craig Townend.
When the dealer discovered the stamps were stolen, he reported the name to the police. It then emerged that Townend had tried something similar before. 10 years earlier, he and an accomplice carried out an armed raid on the York City Art Gallery, stealing more than £1 million worth of fine art. But he was later caught red-handed as he posed as a dealer, trying to sell on the stolen works, and was sentenced to 15 years.
Once released, he was soon up to his old tricks.
A decade later, having secured his first successful stamp sale, detectives were convinced Townend would return to the same North London dealer, and they were right. But this time, the police were ready.
Townend, you're under arrest on suspicion of armed robbery.
I believe Craig Townend is a fantasist for use of masks, pretending to be a police officer, setting himself up as a completely different identity in order to sell these stamps on.
But despite constantly reinventing himself, the true identity of the stamps was never in doubt, and his plan was doomed from the start. Townend was convicted of robbery and sentenced to life in prison.
Life in prison, for the Laird of Glencairn, with a minimum of 10 years, yeah?
Yes, life, because there were so many aggravating factors. It was a terrifying attack. Hooded, guns pressed to your head, shots being fired. Even after the robbery, Townend sent the stamp dealer a bereavement card as a way of warning him off helping the police. The judge described that as pure threat. And all of that, of course, from someone just released from prison for another vicious armed robbery. So that's why he got life.
And Matthew, in court itself, his defence really backfired on him.
It did, incredibly. In the moments before the stamp dealer's son was tied up, he managed to flick his mobile phone into record mode, and he recorded video and some audio of Townend searching the property, so he couldn't deny he was there. So instead, he claimed the stamp dealer was a money launderer for a criminal gang who'd hired him to fake a robbery to clear a debt. Now, the problem with making such an outlandish claim like that, firstly, it wasn't true, and secondly, it entitled the prosecution to put forward evidence of Townend's bad character, and that meant the jury could hear all the details of that York armed robbery, which was very similar to this, all the details of his previous conviction, so it totally backfired.
And what about what he actually chose to steal? I mean, these stamps, unique is not too strong a word, these valuable stamps.
No, I mean, he thought, steal them, sell them, easy.
Yeah.
What he didn't know was that every stamp has minute differences, and those differences are all catalogued by the stamp dealer. So, for example, if you tear two stamps apart along the perforations, some of the perforations will tear long, some of the perforations will tear short. Under a microscope, you can never do it the same way twice. So, the stamps, in a sense, have fingerprints. Townend had his criminal fingerprints, and they were all over this.
There we are. Matthew, thanks very much. Time now for